Hi, this is Ian Pettigrew, and welcome to a whole new podcast series from me and from Kingfisher Coaching. We're going to be doing a lot about telling people stories of strengths and stories of hope, but also reviewing a lot of resources and making recommendations about really helpful resources. And one of the first things I was going to do was start off with a book review of a really helpful book called The Inner Fire, A Coaching Alchemy. But I've actually got one stage further because I am interviewing the author of that book. So rather than me talk about my opinions, I get to spend some time with Stuart. So Stuart, thank you very much for joining me. And I'd love you just to tell people a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and thank you for inviting me. So I'm Stuart Eglin, and short version of who I am, I'm a coach, been coaching for about 18 years now, master practitioner coach, and I'm a writer, obviously, that's why I'm here today. And my third role is as a chief explorer. I was a chief executive in the NHS, semi-retired about 15, 16 months ago now, and developed a new role and identity for myself as the chief explorer, which is a role out in the outside world and in my head as well. So I explore externally and internally as well.
Oh, that's so interesting. I think we could probably talk about that all day as well, but I want to make sure we do focus on the book. So who is the book for? Who have you aimed it at? And what do you hope that they will get out of it?
I love that question, and it always challenges me when I'm asked that question. Principally because I write books for myself initially. I sit down to write a book because I need to write it, and it's something that's in my head that I need to articulate and make sense of. That's not a very good reason for an explanation for who a book's for, because that doesn't sell books, really, does it? It doesn't get books into people's hands.
Well, it sells one.
Exactly. So the step beyond that, as a coach, I wanted to write about my coaching practice and about my own particular way of looking at coaching as a practice. So the book, of course, is extremely helpful for coaches, I think, and will be provocative to their practice and get them to think about how they work. But it's also very useful for people who are interested in coaching as a potential client, somebody who wants to do some work on themselves, I think could get a lot from this as a first step towards diving into what coaching is actually about itself. Quite a few of my clients have found the book really helpful, for example.
So you mentioned being provocative. How do you want to provoke coaches? What does this bring? What are you prodding and provoking?
So the book's grounded in about 20 years of research, going back all the way to my PhD thesis, which I completed in 2004. And it's therefore part of a broader challenge and a broader kind of campaign that I'm on to get people to think differently. And I know lots of people talk about thinking differently. What I'm talking about is embracing the ephemeral, the uncertain, and the emergent in life. There's a strong trend, for quite good reasons, towards behavioural research, towards research grounded in neuroscience. And there's no doubt that a lot of research in those fields brings a lot to coaching. But there's a danger that we nail coaching down to just the things we can measure, the targets we can set, the goals we can achieve with our clients, and we get into a very narrow frame of reference. I'm really interested in how coaching can take us out of that to the kind of the wonder and the magic of things, and to looking at how we can take people on a journey towards the spectacular person that they are within, that often isn't apparent to the client until they have the opportunity to explore that more.
I think that's one of the things I loved about this book, because I think it's really important that coaches are really highly trained. And I think there's a real danger in the industry that there's people that don't necessarily receive enough training. And I'm always constantly learning and studying. But I think there's a danger there that we try to tie processing down to the process and the evidence base, and it becomes restrictive. So I think that sweet spot for how do you make sure coaches are equipped, but also can help to find that space to make the magic happen. That's such an important space, which is why I think this book is so important. So Can you talk a bit more about alchemy? Because that, I don't even think you used the word in that brief introduction then.
No.
But that's what we're talking about. So there's a load of really important concepts in the book. So can you talk to us a bit about the process of alchemy and how you came to get so fascinated by it?
Sure. So my work is grounded in Jungian psychology, and in particularly more recent aspects of Jungian psychology, a school of psychology called the archetypal psychologist, founded by James Hillman. And James Hillman trained under Jung, and then he was an American, went back to the States and built and developed this school, and a kind of collective of psychologists worked around him on developing imaginal approaches to psychology as a field. And I mention all of that because if you go back to Jung, one of the key aspects of Jung's work was alchemy, looking at alchemy and bringing. Now, Jung was writing in the last century, but he was dragging alchemy from a long way ago, a field that had been largely discredited because a lot of people thought of alchemy as it was written about at the time, as the work of bearded elderly gentlemen in laboratories trying to turn lead into gold. Those people were working at a time when it was very dangerous to be regarded as a heretic, and in very religious times where we could be persecuted for our views. So I think there's a lot of evidence to show that the alchemists actually, although they may have been working in the precursors to chemistry, alchemy, chemistry, to understand how basic elements worked, they were also looking at the link between the external world and the internal world. So when those early alchemists were talking about alchemical transformation, they were as much talking about their own internal transformation as they were about the transformation in the laboratory. Okay, and I think there's a lot of writings and evidence to suggest that separation between the outer and inner worlds was less apparent in those days. Actually, there was a kind of blending of how those two things worked. So I'm talking about alchemy as a metaphor for the process of coaching, for looking at how we work with a client on the developmental pathway. And in that developmental journey, the client goes through an alchemical transformation. Now, it's fair to say a lot of coaching is fairly basic practical stuff. So I will work with clients, as you do, Ian, on how they organize themselves, how they kind of become better at time management, how they delegate better. There's lots of practical stuff around, particularly around leadership coaching. But this book is focused more on the transformational work we do with people, where, to coin, I use this phrase in the book, we see an aha moment with the client. We see the eyes light up and then think, oh, wait, hang on a minute. And something shifts and changes at a paradigm level, at a deeper level, at an alchemical level.
And as a coach like you, I'm sure I love those moments because you can see them coming. You can see the person thinking out loud and sort of, the nod and the movement, and then the sort of, and then it comes without you as a coach having said anything. You've left them alone for a minute or two and just being quiet and held the space. So, in a nutshell, and I say in a nutshell because I suspect the answer is read the book. How do coaches create the conditions for alchemy, for this transformation?
I do talk about this quite a bit in the book, and the book uses metaphor quite extensively. It's quite a complex structure to the book. And one aspect of early on in the book, I talk about the conditions. We're talking online, we're talking through a video connection. Don't know about you, Ian, but for the last few years, since just really slightly before COVID, but very much during and since COVID, I've been pretty much extensively working online. So I do address the issues about how you work in a space with a person, how you lay the room out, how you create the right kind of environment as a coach with the client. Those things apply online as well, and giving thought to how we create the right space and the right environment for that is important there too. Then I think the safe space. So every client, every coach will do this. You start the session with creating a confidential, safe space, getting a rapport, working with the client to get them at ease, to get them to work, to then open up and start to talk about the kind of things that they want to bring to the session. I then go on to talk in the book about the kind of what's going on in my head when I'm working as a coach and the kind of things I'm doing to encourage us into that space. I don't want to give the sense here that every session is a transformational aha moment kind of thing. That's not coaching, is it? I mean, we'll work with a client over a period of time, and some of it, as I've already said, may be very practical, down to earth work. But then a pivot moment will come where an opening happens, where we can start to go a little deeper, start to dig a bit further off into the future, start to kind of work at what might be. And when we're in that space, then I'm starting to talk about how we use the 4 elements and how we can create opportunities and space for the person to start to pick that through and work through where they need to go to. Does that give you a sense of what I'm talking about? Is that helpful?
Yeah, and the particular bit of the book, I think one of the things that sticks in my mind most is where you talked about the table and the coach and the client or coachee sort of setting out the table. And there was a real sense of purpose, of an intent. There was a reason why you were there for the conversation. But also there was a sense of, I think, did you use the expression laying out the elements and
Yes.
sort of creating the space for that alchemy, for that transformation to happen. So I think it's a really powerful metaphor for coaching.
Yeah, and there are several aspects of metaphor in there. So I talk about the practical, obvious stuff like we need to be alert and alive with all of our senses when we're working as a coach. All 5 of the most obvious senses. There are plenty more beyond that in terms of intuition and the kind of feeling of energies within the room and so on. But then I talk quite often in the book about the 4 elements from ancient times of fire, earth, air, and water. And again, metaphorical sense in which they have a role to play in the coaching process. And so, yeah, we lay the table out in the way that an alchemist would. And then we have various tools we can bring to bear to use. And then the actual process of alchemy is that work with the 4 elements. And I can talk a bit more about that if that's helpful.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the 4 elements now? And then I really want to ask you some more about the structure of the book.
Yeah. So, as I say, this is metaphorical. And I know there's a table of elements in modern chemistry which is much more sophisticated than this. So if I start with fire, the metaphor here is of the vessel that the alchemist is working with, heating up and creating heat to melt the solid. Okay, as a coach, we are heating up the conversation. We're creating energy in the space. We're asking challenging questions to melt the sense of identity, the focus of who the person thinks they are. And we work at that fire and we create the fire to do that. Things don't necessarily happen in this order, but I'll take them in a particular order just to kind of demonstrate the point. We may get a moment in the conversation where something resonates, something triggers, and emotion starts to happen. We've all worked regularly with clients, haven't we, where an emotion comes forward, tears, sort of maybe anger, some kind, but often emotional kind of letting go of the tears and the feelings around something. There's the water coming forward. So that's the second element, the element of water starting to release. And then the element of air, where we're kind of like creating space and the air around to create an openness for the person to explore and think. We may be leaving silence, creating time and moments to just think and unpick what's going on and give the client a time to actually just process what's happened there. And then the 4th one, earth, where we're then getting them to grounding, yeah, and bringing them back to a stable sense of what does this mean here? What's going on? What's just happened? Yeah, as you said earlier, Ian, about that moment where the person goes, and you have no idea what's going on in their head. And once you've given them the time to do the emotion, the water, and the air, to the space, you then give them an opportunity to ground, come out back, and start to talk about what's happened. That's just one example. You can work this lots of different ways, and the elements can go in different orders and so on. But does that give you a sense, hopefully, of how I'm using the metaphor of the 4 different elements to think about the interaction between client and coach?
Absolutely. And talking about metaphor and structure is probably a neat segue into the structure of the book.
Yeah.
And so, if I confess, I tend to speed read books, and I will often use little gaps of low quality time. You'll find me, I'll arrive early on a client site and I'll do a few minutes reading and reception, or I will listen to a lot of audiobooks. And I was sort of doing my usual speed reading with your book, and then I had to start again from the beginning because it's a really interesting structure with layers and layers to it, and I had to slow right down and highlight and really take time. And I think it's one of those books where if you invest the time in the book, you will gain a lot, but you can't just sort of whiz through. So can you explain a little bit about the structure of the book and about why you've chosen to structure it, and the letters, in fact, as well, that you've used within?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot to say about this, really. I worked on first draft of the book. I had a lot of sense of the different things I wanted to do with this, and there were different ways I wanted to work. Using metaphor meant I wanted to use a lot of metaphor in the book. I wanted to use different techniques. As you've seen, there's straightforward things you'd find in a non-fiction book like this, the chapters which give you the raw kind of the basic ingredients of the book, if you like. And then beyond that, there are imaginary letter exchanges, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. There are poems in there as well, and then there are comments and statements from some imaginary characters who are my own inner archetypal characters that I've developed over the last maybe 3 or 4 decades now. And I wanted all of those to be in the book. And I think it's fair to say the first full draft of the book that I sent out to readers to have a look at, like, I don't really understand this. I can't figure this all out. And some were saying, you need simplifying. You need to make this easier to read. There's a challenge there because our readers I was talking to this morning said that they were reading the book and loved the simplicity of the language. It's actually very easy to read. It's a complex structure. So the way I describe the structure right up front is like the human body. And the human body is composed of a skeleton. It's composed of a blood system, a lymphatic system, a nerve system. So there are different systems in the body. And the book has that kind of structure. So it has a structure of chapters that take you through the various influences that I'm drawing on in the development of this model. And then a structure, the second half around, here's some examples of the kind of approaches and techniques that I think are important and that have devolved from the work. There's then a set of poems running through, because I think poetry brings a whole new richness and complexity to the thinking, which helps to say the very difficult to say, because it's sometimes very difficult to express something in prose, but much easier in poetry. There's then a sequence of letters with Carl Jung, with James Hillman, where I've written imaginary letters to those people who've been really influential in my life, and written the responses too. So, I couldn't get responses because they're not alive, unfortunately. Yeah. But I could imagine those responses, which gets you into that archetypal active imagination process, which was something that Jung developed. And then there's a sequence of these responses and comments coming in from the archetypes that I've evolved and developed over the years that are my own personal archetypes. So my inner anima, the wise old man, the child. It's various characters, and the shadow come trickster, giving me challenge and pushing back and giving different perspectives on things. It's not difficult to do this. I've worked over the years to develop those persona and write with those persona. So it gives me an opportunity to see things from a different perspective. You might think, what's that on earth has that all got to do with coaching? Well, those personas, archetypes, use whatever language you want to use, are really good ways of getting clients to work differently, to think outside their own perspective, it's quite common for coaches to get people who maybe somebody's having a challenge with the boss to go in and get in the shoes of the boss, sit in that chair and think, what are they thinking right now? And it really strains and challenges your thinking. So it's simply a method like that. I'm adopting different aspects of me to think differently about things. So the book sounds complicated, but once you understand the structure, and if, as you say, if you can take the time to sit down and work through it, it's, I think, reasonably easy to follow. But then I wrote it, so I would say that.
No, I loved it. I love it. I highly recommend it. I've got so much out of it. I just wanted to get that point across that it's like, do not speed read it. This is not the literary equivalent of junk food. In my opinion, it's something to savour and to put the effort in order to get the most out of, and also potentially experience that personal transformation as well. That alchemy. So to live by the principles of the book. Now, there's a couple of concepts that I'd really just like to hear more from you about that absolutely fascinate me. And one is individuation that you and I have talked about before. And because I think that's I'm not going to say why I think it's fascinating, because I'd love to hear from you, because you understand this way better than I do. But also the whole idea of acornness and about what happens to an acorn. So can you talk to us a bit about individuation and acornness? What do they mean, and what place do you think they have in coaching?
Yeah. Let me say, I think this is my take on individuation. So I've studied Jung quite extensively, but I'm not a Jungian psychologist, so there's every possibility that someone will drop a note into you and say, I think you'll find that Stuart Eglin has completely misrepresented Jung's sense of what individuation is. This is my take. And my take is to simplify quite a complex concept in Jung's work, that essentially Jung's idea is that we come into life as a baby with a coherent wholeness. We are whole and complete. And that then as we grow, and particularly as we go through childhood, initially all we have in our sights, the only entity, I'm sorry to fathers like me, but is the mother. It's that one entity. And then as we grow and develop, for our survival and to thrive, we need to connect with other people, and we do that and need to please people, and we need to get fed, and we need to gain knowledge, and so on. And all those processes, for all the right reasons, mean that we tend to start to fragment and break into individual senses of who we are. And it's best described and best known if you think about how you are as you're growing up, in the company of your friends, in the company of your family, in the company of your work colleagues or school friends if you're still at school, and so on. And all these different settings, you'll be a kind of a different version of yourself. And the fragmentation continues. And then as we go through life and we reach the decades of life, 30, 40, 50, 60, we reach points where we maybe reach some kind of minor crisis. It doesn't always happen, but we often reach some kind of existential, who am I? What's going on here? And am I on the right path? And that's that process of individuation of, sorry to use my hands, I do this quite a lot, but of these bits of you pulling back together, the bits that feel neglected, of the true essence of who you are, coming together and becoming united again, so that as we go on towards our eventual death, we become a coherent whole again. That was the sense of what Jung was describing. And he talked about dark nights of the soul at each decade point, particularly around midlife, as that process of saying, well, I've been all these things to all people. Who the heck am I in the middle of all of this? Okay, so that's individuation. The acorn theory is James Hillman's modern take on that. And he talks about the sense that the acorn can't be a sycamore tree or any other kind of tree. It's an oak, and it's going to become an oak. Okay, so he's quite determinist and has a sense that when we are born, there is a driver within us. And I use a quote and I've used it in a couple of my books by Mark Twain, who allegedly said, most quotes by Twain might not have actually been him, but that there are two most important days of our life are the day we were born and the day we work out why we were born. And that second one, I think, links really strongly to Hillman's sense of the acorn theory. So I don't think he was determinist in the sense that everything is written for us and we have no free will. Absolutely not. But what he's saying is there is a strong driving urge within us to become something. We have a meaning and a purpose in our lives. The link to our coaching, hopefully, then is quite obvious. What's the coach there to do? It's to tease out that that acornness within the client, and figure out that it's a tree, it's an oak tree they need to become, and help work with them on that. Sorry, that's probably the shortest way of describing it. Is that enough?
Absolutely, it's brilliant, and I could very much apply a strengths lens to that, but I would, which is about sort of helping people connect with who they are, which doesn't set them on one path, but kind of leads to the conversation about then. So thinking very practically, how would a coach help somebody on that journey of individuation? What does that look like?
Without divulging any confidentialities around a client, I can talk about a client I was working with just today who is in the late 40s and has loved their career, but was feeling that they were maybe not quite on the right path, but couldn't quite pin it down. And the earlier coaching conversations we'd had, I'd kind of gone around this, and there'd been practical issues around how they were functioning and operating in everyday life now. But in this one conversation, we were opening into something a bit richer and deeper about, well, what about future person's name? I won't give them, I'll call them Fred, future Fred. Where's future Fred going, and what's future Fred's identity? What does that look like? And from that came some understanding of, well, I always wished I could have been. That's not that, I love what I do now, but it would have been lovely to have done that. Kind of said, well, you can't go back and redo that. We can't go back and reorient. And there are some things that aren't open to us in late 40s that might have been open to us in our early 20s. But what's the essence of the acornness, if I can use that term again, that were wanting to fulfill? And as we talked and opened it out a bit, it wasn't about, again, I sort of don't want to give confidence about the client, but it wasn't about that specific job. It was something that job gave to that person that really kind of was addressing why they were here and what they were here, what fulfilled them. So it was to help a sense of how we get back on the path of where we're meant to be, really.
I think that resonates so much with me, not just in my client work, but with myself. If I look back at my career history, starting with a degree in applied statistics and computing, and then spending time working in digital and digital transformation, then a postgrad in business, then a degree in theology, 12 years on the board of a charity, academic study and work in positive psychology and coaching psychology. Occasionally, I'll sort of look at my CV, or, if I look at my LinkedIn profile and think, do you know what? It just took me a really long time to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up, and I wish I'd figured this out earlier. And then I step back and look, and it's like, no, it's just all these, I'm going to do your hands thing, it's all these individual elements, bit by bit, that all now come together in the work that I do. So no, individuation really resonates me, both in terms of my work with clients, but also myself, and feels very much like an ongoing journey.
I can honestly say, through my career, which has also been very diverse, any job that wasn't quite the fit for the things that drive me, I'd somehow tweak and adapt and adjust and go off job description and do the things that really matter to me. It's almost like I had to do those things, really. So that's why it relates and resonates so strongly with me as well.
Yeah, I get that, which is probably why I haven't got a job and I work for myself now, because always prone to going off piste in that respect. So Stuart, I know you're also busy working on your next book. Are you happy to give us some insight into where that's heading?
Absolutely, yeah. So that will be my fourth book. I've got a working title for it. Perhaps reluctantly to say it, because once it's starting to stick, I think this probably will become the title. It's called The Labyrinth of Labels, and it's about identity and the labels that we give ourselves, and the extent to which those labels are either expansive and helpful and a way of being clear about how we come to the world and what we give the world, or are restrictive and diminishing and kind of box us in a particular way of being seen by those around us. And as I go through and work on this, it won't surprise you, this comes from the same similar paradigms I've worked with extensively now. Hillman's work is going to be an influence here again. But I'm looking at other paradigms too, to see what I can bring together. It's firing me up and getting me really excited, this, because as I talk to people about it, I get some pretty good responses. This emerged from my partial retirement from the National Health Service, and as I was doing that, it took me a year to leave my job. Starting to think about how we define ourselves and the kind of identities that we shed and let go of, and how important it is to define and develop new identities to replace those, to ensure that we thrive and feel fulfilled by what we do. So that's that fourth book. It's the fourth of a series of books I'm writing, which have got the kind of working title of the concept series. The first one was about values-based working. It was called Values Count. The second one was called Insight Coaching, which is a set of practical tools for coaching, looking at the insight kind of process that goes on. And then I've got a long-term plan of approximately 10 different book ideas. Just need to find the time to write them all. So as you can see, I do enjoy writing, given it can be extremely exhausting and frustrating as well, but it's really fulfilling.
Well, your enjoyment of it shows, and maybe you can keep on coming back, and we can keep on talking about each book as you work through numbers 5 through 10.
Keep us going for a decade or so.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, a few final questions, and I'm really interested to know, what difference would you like to see this make to the coaching profession? Big question.
Yeah. So the book's been out for a few months now, and I've set myself a big ambition. Some writers want to sell 1 million, but my ambition is to get the book into the hands, hearts, and minds of 1,000 people, whether they're clients or coaches, because I think what I've kind of shared here, and like all ideas, it's built on a lot of other ideas and a lot of other people's work, and it's been wonderful to work with the dozen or so people whose work I find really inspirational, and develop something from that. It would be wonderful to see some of the work and tools and techniques I've described in the book adopted by other coaches. That would be amazing to see. And for clients to potentially work with some of the ideas in the book and get fired up enough to do that development journey, and potentially do the journey with a coach as well, because I think it's so much easier when you have somebody there working with you to put a mirror up and to kind of reflect and challenge you when appropriate, and support you when you need the support to go on the path that you need to go on.
I think where it might make its biggest, this is my opinion, but feel free to tell me I'm wrong, because it's your book, you wrote it. But I think when I see coaches early in their career and early in the training, they're kind of equipped with a process and the GROW model possibly, and possibly a question bank. And early days of coaching, it's easy to be very mechanistic, very sort of following a rigid process. And even though coaches will work on holding space and being quiet, I think there's still too much process, because it's sort of required in those early days. So I'd love to see coaches, as part of their development, really reading this and applying it to open their eyes to what else is possible. But also, I believe that all managers should have some level of coaching skills. I don't think it's possible to be a people manager and to develop people, particularly when they're different to you. And got different strengths. So I think managers would get a lot of value out of this in terms of helping to understand that sort of manager or leader as coach, and about ways that they can help the magic to happen.
Absolutely agree with that. And if I can add to that, particularly in relation to the coach, um, early stage of a career as a coach, I think it is really important to learn tools, techniques, approaches, the grow model, and so on. But these are elements of scaffolding that help us to stand tall and confident as a coach. And as we then develop the confidence and the experience and wisdom, we need to take the scaffolding away, so we don't approach a coaching session thinking, I've seen one of these before, I need to go and get my hammer, or I think I'll just take you through this technique because I'm feeling a bit nervous here and I'm not sure where we're going. To get to a place where you are just present, entirely present with the client, in service of the client, and waiting to see where this conversation goes, where every coaching conversation then just becomes a wonderfully curious conversation where you have all these things logged away, but you only draw them lightly if they're helpful. You don't kind of use it because it makes you feel better. You use it because the client goes, oh, yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. Let's go down that particular pathway and see where that leads us. So I think I'm saying what you said in a slightly different way, but it's absolutely that, that we enter a conversation open and empty and waiting and seeing what emerges.
And that's about being a really mature coach, isn't it? In terms of, as you see somebody develop and the coaching maturity develops, it brings that confidence to create that space for the magic to happen. My final question, I don't want to be reductionist, but I'm really interested to know, if there was just one thing that people could take away from this book, if there's just one thing that you could create some alchemy and see that transformation in people, what would it be?
Step into the mystery. When we're working with a client, often, say if this resonates with you, Ian, I will be in the middle of a process. I will feel the creative tension in my head of, I have no idea where to go with this. I understand why the client's brought this and is working with this because, oh my goodness, this is tough and difficult. I don't know the answer. And to sit and be relaxed about that and wait, see what happens. And then somewhere in the mystery, things emerge from the client or from your intuition. And deep in your intuition, you bring something will surface to just test and try, or you just listen to what the client is saying and then see where it goes. And those are often the times where I'll come out of the conversation kind of bouncing around, going, oh my God, that was a great conversation. I can't believe where that went. Because I trusted the process.
I think at that point, I will end it there, because what a beautiful note on which to end, and a very profound and deep one. So just to say, Stuart, thank you so much for your time today. And I would wholeheartedly recommend this book to lots of people. A really good read. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Ian. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks.